Attention, attention, this is History Lost in Time. And welcome to episode 67 of the History Lost in Time podcast. This podcast is available in German and English and can be found on YouTube, Spotify, Podcast.de, Blue Sky and Instagram. There's also a music-based partner project on YouTube called L20e Music. The topic of this episode: having released episodes on all battleship classes of the German Empire from Brandenburg to L20e Alpha, as well as the scuttling of the high seas fleet at Scapa Flow, I am now turning my attention to the era of the Reichsmarine. What happened to the German Navy after the Treaty of Versailles? In this episode, I'll focus primarily on the battleships. The cruisers, also highly interesting, will be discussed sometime in the future once I have finished covering all of the German battleships. Political agenda and background: none. The sources that were used: Günter Kroschel, August Ludwig Evers, The German Fleet 1848 to 1945, Lose Eising Publishing House, Wilhelmshaven 1962, third revised edition 1964. Hans-Jürgen Hansen, The Ships of the German Fleets 1848 to 1945, Bechtermünz Publishing House, authorized licensed edition for Weltbild Publishing House, Augsburg 1998. And as usual, online sources as supplementary material. After the scuttling of the high seas fleet at Scapa Flow in June 1919 and the subsequent second decimation of the German fleet, no modern warships remained in Germany. Only completely outdated and in some cases even disarmed ships remained in the country. From the Allied perspective, they were of no interest and worthless, which is why Germany was allowed to keep them. The early years of the Weimar Republic were not good for the country, its people or the navy. In November 1918, naval personnel had triggered the revolution. Right-wing naval personnel had supported the Kapp Putsch against the government in March 1920, which could only be suppressed by a general strike. More on this in episode 41. Within just a year and a half, the Navy had thus actively participated in two coup attempts, one from the right and one from the left. The Navy's reputation had plummeted, and there was even talk of disbanding it entirely and concentrating its meager budget solely on the army. This rumor was deliberately kept alive by the then Reichswehr Minister Gessler, which made both the Navy and the industries dependent on it more willing to cooperate. The legal framework for the German Navy was very restrictive, as stipulated by the Treaty of Versailles. The number of ships was strictly limited. 6 battleships plus 2 reserves, 6 cruisers plus 2 reserves, 12 destroyers plus 4 reserves, 12 torpedo boats plus 4 reserves, 38 minesweepers and 25 other smaller vessels. A maximum of 15,000 men were permitted to serve in the Navy. This limit meant that initially only a fraction of the already significantly reduced fleet could be manned and operated. In 1922, the Navy was only able to operate 2 battleships and 5 cruisers. The rest lay more or less unused in port. The Navy therefore had to reduce crew sizes and increase training levels at all costs in order to have more ships operational simultaneously. So what was the state of the German Navy's battleship fleet? In fact, a total of 9 battleships were available, one more than stipulated in the treaty. Let's take a brief look at each ship. The Zähringen was the oldest ship in the battleship fleet. She belonged to the Wittelsbach class. Her construction began in 1899 and she was commissioned in 1902. The rapid technological advances before the First World War quickly rendered her obsolete, and she was decommissioned as early as 1912. At the beginning of the First World War she was reactivated, but in November 15 she was disarmed and converted into a target ship. In 1918 she was to be converted into an accommodation ship, but this plan was never fully realized. The Zähringen was therefore more of a large, disarmed and no longer seaworthy shell than a combat-ready vessel, which is why she was left with the German Empire. Slightly younger than the Zähringen were the battleships of the Braunschweig class. This class comprised the ships Preußen, Lothringen, Braunschweig, Elsass, and Hessen. Construction of these ships began around 1902 and they were commissioned around 1905. With the development of the dreadnought in Great Britain in 1905, they became obsolete. Their decommissioning was planned for around 1914, and the Elsass and the Braunschweig had already been decommissioned in 1913. At the outbreak of war, all the ships were reactivated and saw some combat. The Hessen was the only ship of this class to participate in the largest naval battle of the war, the Battle of Jutland. However, the ships were only capable of performing support roles and were therefore even decommissioned during the war. Lothringen and Hessen ended up as training ships, the Braunschweig as a residential ship. The three most modern battleships of the German Navy were the Schleswig-Holstein, the Schlesien, and the Hannover. They belonged to the Deutschland class, which was built around 1906 and commissioned around 1908. These ships differed only slightly from the Braunschweig class, including some modifications to their engine layouts and slightly improved armor. However, they too had become obsolete due to the development of the dreadnought and played only a minor role in the First World War. All three ships participated in the Battle of Jutland, but were subsequently reassigned to secondary duties. While the Hannover served as a harbor defense vessel, the Schleswig-Holstein and the Schlesien were used as training and accommodation ships. The Deutschland-class battleships had virtually identical technical specifications to the Braunschweig-class ships. This was also reflected in their crew sizes, which were exactly the same. Comparing the specifications of the Braunschweig and Deutschland battleships with the most modern battleships of the British, American, and French navies at the time reveals a clear difference in class. The Allied battleships were significantly faster, heavier, better armored, possessed considerably more and larger guns with greater range, and featured modern equipment such as torpedo protection and anti-aircraft defenses. In a duel with one of the remaining German battleships, they would have been able to control the engagement at all times and thus hold all the cards. This was the backbone of the Reichsmarine. 8 outdated battleships, some of which had been decommissioned before or even during the First World War, and some of which were completely disarmed. The Reichsmarine had only about 10% of the Reichswehr's total budget at its disposal. This made modernization and necessary investments extremely difficult. What happened to the battleships? Despite their advanced age and low combat effectiveness, they were slowly reactivated, as new construction was out of the question, and it was better to have old weak ships than none at all. The Zähringen was already unfit for service and disarmed, therefore it was used as a target ship. However, this didn't happen until 1927, when all the other ships had already been reactivated. The Zähringen served in this capacity until the end of the Second World War. The ships of the Braunschweig class were the first to be reactivated. Personnel and financial shortages meant that the ships could not all be reactivated simultaneously. The Preußen and the Lothringen were converted into minesweeper motherships, but were finally decommissioned and scrapped in 1929 and 1931 respectively. The other three ships were gradually returned to service: the Braunschweig in 1921, the Elsass in 1924, and the Hessen in 1925. These ships served as flagships until the Deutschland ships were operational again. The Braunschweig was decommissioned in 26 and scrapped in 31. The Elsass was deactivated in 1930 and scrapped in 31, and the Hessen was converted into a target ship in 34 and served in that role until the end of the Second World War and even into the early 1960s for the Soviet Navy. Of the Deutschland ships, the Hannover was the first to be reactivated in 21 and used as the Baltic flagship. She was deactivated from 27 to 30, then served again from 30 to 31, before being permanently deactivated. She did not see action in World War II. Instead, she was scrapped starting in 1944, presumably for raw materials. The Schleswig-Holstein became the fleet flagship in February 26 and served in this role until the end of 36. Afterward, she became a training ship. She saw some action in World War II in 39 and 40, after which she returned to being a training ship. She was scheduled to be reactivated again in 1944, but was sunk in an air raid. After the war, she was salvaged and taken to the Soviet Union as war booty, where she served as a target ship until 1966. The Schlesien was commissioned in 27 and modernized shortly before the outbreak of war. She also served as a training ship, but saw combat in 39 and 40, and again in 44 and 45. She was sunk near Swinemünde in 45 and slowly scrapped over the following decades. As you can see, the battleships were never all in service at the same time. In an emergency, roughly half of the battleships would have been ready for deployment. Although there were modernization measures on the ships, nobody could be satisfied with this third-rate navy in the long run. By the mid-1920s, calls for new battleships grew louder. However, this proved difficult given the contractual restrictions and limited financial resources. According to Article 190 of the Treaty of Versailles, battleships and cruisers could only be replaced after 20 years of service. Since the last Deutschland-class battleship entered service in 1908, this requirement was met for all battleships by 1928. The second condition, however, was the maximum displacement, 10,000 tons. This was less than the displacement of the Braunschweig class, and barely a third of the displacement of modern Western battleships. The Allies' intention was clear. Germany was no longer to have battleships, but only heavy cruisers. The Germans accepted the challenge. Modern manufacturing methods reduced weight and maximized firepower. The motto was, stronger than anything you can't escape from, faster than anything you can't defeat. The result was the Deutschland class, armored ships with surprisingly heavy armor and battleship armament, stronger than heavy cruisers and faster than battleships. The German Navy thus filled a gap between battleships and heavy cruisers. The left-wing parliamentary forces initially opposed the pocket battleship project. However, after the SPD's election victory in 1928, the SPD Chancellor Hermann Müller yielded to the bourgeois parties on this issue. The Grand Coalition, which governed from 1928 to 30, therefore launched the pocket battleship project. The construction of 2 more ships of this class was approved by the Reichstag in 1931 and 32. The 3 pocket battleships were named Deutschland, Admiral Scheer and Admiral Graf Spee. Their official designation in Germany was initially Panzerschiff, armored ship, and from 1940 onward Schwerer Kreuzer, heavy cruiser. Abroad they were known as pocket battleships. Due to their sequential construction, the ships of this class differed slightly from one another. Therefore, I will use the class's namesake, the Deutschland, to briefly review its technical specifications. The Deutschland was 186 meters long, approximately 21 meters wide, and had a draft of about 7 meters. Its standard displacement was 10,600 tons, but this could increase to a maximum of 14,290 tons during wartime service. Officially, of course, it was 10,000 tons. The crew consisted of 1,150 men, significantly more than on the older battleships. Its top speed was 28 knots. This made it faster than the Allied battleships of the time. The main armament consisted of 6 28-centimeter guns, while the secondary armament comprised 8 15-centimeter guns, 3 88mm anti-aircraft guns, and 8 533mm torpedo tubes. In addition to onboard aircraft could be carried, which could carry light bombs in addition to onboard weapons. The Deutschland was commissioned in 1933, the Admiral Scheer in 1934 and the Admiral Graf Spee in 1936. All 3 ships saw action in World War II. The Deutschland, which was renamed Lützow during the war, was scuttled in Swinemünde in May 1945. The Admiral Scheer was sunk in an air raid in Kiel in April 1945, capsized and was later covered with rubble and buried. The Admiral Graf Spee was scuttled by her own crew off Montevideo in December 1939 after a naval battle in the South Atlantic to prevent internment. Originally, the new pocket battleships were intended to replace the old Braunschweig-class battleships, while the newer Deutschland-class battleships were to remain in service. However, by the time the pocket battleships were completed, the Weimar Republic, and thus the Reichsmarine in its original form, no longer existed. In 1935, Adolf Hitler officially declared the Treaty of Versailles invalid, and there were no longer any restrictions on the German Navy's armament. The first steps toward this had already been initiated by Reichswehr Minister Kurt von Schleicher in July 1932 after failed negotiations with the Allies. He had set in motion an expansion of the Navy as well as the construction of submarines, a naval air force, and an aircraft carrier. The Nazis therefore simply had to continue these measures after seizing power. Even before the Nazis seized power, the German Navy planned the construction of two more pocket battleships, the Gneisenau and the Scharnhorst, internally designated Panzership D and E. After the French responded to the German pocket battleships with the construction of the Dunkerque class, the plans for the Gneisenau and Scharnhorst were significantly altered in the summer of 1934, and the two ships were built and commissioned in an enlarged and reinforced form as battleships of the Scharnhorst class. Only their successors, the battleships Bismarck and Tirpitz, also internally designated Battleship F and G, were designed from the outset without any restrictions imposed by the Treaty of Versailles, and these would also be the last battleships built in Germany. A few finishing words. Let's summarize briefly. After the First World War, the German Navy's backbone consisted of nothing more than a collection of completely outdated and, in some cases, already decommissioned and mothballed battleships. With limited resources, this battleship fleet was recommissioned and modernized where possible. It wasn't until the late 1920s that an attempt was made to develop new modern ships, the Deutschland-class armored ships, to replace the completely obsolete Braunschweig-class battleships. Until the mid-1930s, however, the German Navy was at best a third-rate force, posing no real threat to anyone. Thank you. This was History Lost in Time.